We begin at the epicenter of a world that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of gold and blood. Forget Rome, forget Babylon. Can you believe that just 700 years ago, in the middle of a massive, shimmering lake, stood the single most powerful, most terrifying, and richest city humanity had ever dared to construct?
This wasn't just a civilization. It was an impossible miracle of mud and stone, ruling over 25 million souls, demanding tribute not just in gold and jade, but in the most precious commodity of all, pulsing human hearts. We are talking about Tenochtitlan, the beating obsidian heart of the Aztec Empire, a jewel so magnificent it literally floated on the water, connected to the mainland by colossal causeways that defied engineering and logic. A catastrophe no one saw coming was already breathing down their necks, disguised as destiny. But in 1519, the Aztecs believed they were immortal. Their empire, the terrifying Triple Alliance, stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, a dominion forged in fire and fueled by the ceaseless, horrifying hunger of their sun god, Huitzilopochtli.
Imagine standing atop the Templo Mayor, the towering, blood-slicked pyramid dedicated simultaneously to war and to rain. Below you, over 200,000 citizens moved through a maze of immaculate canals, a network cleaner and more organized than any major city in Europe at the time.
Their markets, the tianguis, were teeming with unimaginable wealth. Vanilla, rubber, shimmering quetzal feathers, cocoa beans serving as currency, and weapons honed from volcanic glass, obsidian, so sharp they could decapitate a man in a single surgical stroke. The level of luxury and technological prowess was astounding, yet it was all built on a foundation of bone-chilling fear. Here is the dark secret no history book truly screams about. The entire world they built was constructed around a ticking clock. Their greatest fear wasn't invasion. Their existential terror was that the sun would fail to rise tomorrow. They believed they lived in the epoch known as the Fifth Sun, an era preceded by 4 disastrous cataclysms, each ending in total annihilation by flood, wind, fire, or savage beasts. They knew this current sun had to end too, and it was their sacred, terrifying duty to delay that ending through staggering, unimaginable acts of dedication. This constant, gnawing dread permeated every single breath, every harvest, every council meeting. The priests were not merely religious leaders. They were cosmic engineers, desperately trying to grease the gears of the universe with the richest oil available, the life force extracted right from the chests of their enemies. Think about the sheer logistics of fear required to sustain an empire this vast. How do you keep 400 conquered city-states in line? Not just through armies, though their warriors, the elite Jaguar and Eagle Knights, were the most feared fighters in the Western Hemisphere. You keep them in line through spiritual terror
and crushing taxes paid in human beings demanded for the holy altar.
When a major temple was consecrated, the sacrifice wasn't a handful of prisoners. It was an industrial-scale massacre designed to shock the soul. When the Templo Mayor was formally rebuilt in 1487, the official Aztec histories, the ones they wrote and preserved, claimed 80,400 people were sacrificed over 4 days.
Can you even begin to visualize that scale of human horror? It was a ritual of profound, fundamental faith and political dominance. A statement broadcast across the entire valley of Mexico. Cooperate, pay your tribute, or you will feed the sun. And yet, for all their intellectual power, for all their astronomical precision, for all the gold lining the chambers of their emperor, Moctezuma II, they were fundamentally blind to the real, immediate danger. They focused entirely on the heavens, worrying about planetary alignments and the prophesied return of the benevolent feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl. They looked for omens in the sky, in the depths of the lake, in the dreams of their silent, brooding emperor, a man obsessed with prophecy and the weight of his own divine lineage. They heard whispers of floating wooden houses carrying bearded, pale men, but they dismissed them as trivial coastal rumors, as fishermen's tales blown in on the humid sea air. They were the masters of their own destiny, weren't they? They were the chosen people of the sun. They had calculated the end of the world, and it wasn't yet due.
This overconfidence, this spectacular arrogance born of unparalleled success, was the devastating chink in their obsidian armor. The world was about to collide, not with a mythological serpent god, but with something far more mundane, far more ruthless, and entirely unexpected. A small band of ambitious, desperate men, driven not by celestial fear, but by God, glory, and pure, unadulterated Spanish greed. We are about to dive deep into the final, agonizing decade of the Aztec world, a story of staggering beauty, terrifying rituals, and the sudden, violent shattering of an empire that truly believed it would last forever. Get ready, because the blood moon is rising over Tenochtitlan, and the dawn they prayed for is about to be violently stolen. This is the ultimate tale of hubris meeting history. Forget Rome. Forget Babylon. What the Mexica people did in the year 1325 AD was less like building a city and more like defying the laws of physics. They didn't settle on stable ground. They took a massive, salty, mosquito-infested lake, Lake Texcoco, and they built the greatest metropolis the world had ever seen right in the middle of it. This was Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, a civilization that, at its peak, was home to over 200,000 souls, a population eclipsing almost every major European capital of the time, including Paris and London. It was a floating diamond, a masterpiece of engineering. Connected to the mainland only by 4 titanic stone causeways that stretched for miles across the dark water. These causeways were the ultimate defense system, controlled by removable bridges, ensuring that the city was essentially an impregnable fortress against any conventional attack. Below the surface of the lake, their agricultural genius was on full display. The chinampas, floating gardens built from mud, reeds, and decaying vegetation, churned out endless harvests of maize, beans, and squash, feeding the colossal population. This was not just a successful society. It was a meticulous, highly organized, and impossibly wealthy superpower operating on water, powered equally by human ingenuity and, tragically, human blood. The central market of Tlatelolco was a dizzying spectacle of opulence, where thousands of merchants traded gold, jade, iridescent quetzal feathers, cocoa beans, and rubber balls sourced from territories thousands of miles away. But even as they reveled in this impossible wealth, a spiritual shadow stretched longer than any causeway across the city, a cold fear that dictated every political move. This shadow was the crushing weight of their cosmology. The Mexica people believed they were living in the era of the fifth sun, and that 4 previous worlds had already been violently destroyed, swallowed by darkness or consumed by monstrous beasts. The fate of the current world rested squarely on their shoulders, demanding a constant, desperate, moment-to-moment bribe to the gods. Chief among these demanding deities was Huitzilopochtli, the mighty sun god and the patron deity of the Mexica, who was perpetually starving. To keep the cosmic engine running, to ensure the sun rose and fought off the monstrous forces of night, Huitzilopochtli and the other gods needed Teotl, the sacred, powerful energy of life itself. And the most potent, most concentrated source of Teotl? The freshly beating human heart, still warm and pulsing with vitality. High above the shimmering canals, dominating the sacred precinct, stood the massive, terrifying structure of the Templo Mayor, the spiritual and geographical center of their entire universe. This was not one temple, but a colossal dual pyramid structure, dedicated on one side to the sun god Huitzilopochtli, and on the other to Tlaloc, the ancient, relentless rain god. 2 gods, 2 constant, terrifying needs, requiring thousands upon thousands of lives to satisfy. The pyramid structure itself was terrifyingly steep, designed to make the final ascent agonizing and dramatic, ensuring that the last moments of the captive's life, the ultimate offering, were visible to the thousands gathered below in the great plaza. The priests, known as Tlamacazque, were not simply religious figures, they were executioners, their bodies matted and crusted, smelling perpetually of stale blood, their long, uncut hair tangled with the sacrificial residue, living embodiments of the gods' relentless demands. The sheer logistical nightmare of placating these forces was astronomical. We know from historical records of the dedication of the enlarged Templo Mayor in 1487
that for 4 consecutive days the blood ritual was non-stop. Historians estimate that the line of captives stretched so far back that the executioners barely had time to clean the sacrificial stone before the next victim arrived. The pavement slick, not with water, but with the vital fluid meant to save the entire world.
Every citizen understood the contract. Their prosperity, their very existence, depended on the smooth operation of the great ritual engine on the Templo Mayor summit. If the heart beat, the sun rose. If the heart stopped, the world ended. This existential burden drove their entire society, demanding absolute obedience and unflinching participation in the grotesque theater of divine maintenance.
The powerful warriors of Tenochtitlan, fierce, disciplined, masters of the obsidian-edged Macuahuitl, did not fight to kill. They fought to capture. A dead enemy was useless. A living captive was essential currency for cosmic survival. This was the dark, cynical engine driving the infamous Flower Wars. Orchestrated agreements with neighboring city-states like Tlaxcala to provide a steady, high-quality supply of sacrificial victims. The state was fundamentally organized around acquiring life for the gods.
They had subjugated dozens of tributary states across a dominion that spanned from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, forcing them to deliver unimaginable taxes. 7,000 tons of corn annually, thousands of cloaks, bundles of rare feathers, and most importantly, the ongoing tariff of human bodies. Their empire was a meticulously organized machine of extraction, designed not just for wealth and power, but for survival against a threat they believed originated not from Earth, but from the terrifying, unpredictable heavens themselves.
The arrogance stemming from their success was monumental. Safe behind their lake defenses, utterly convinced of their own divine favor and military superiority, they looked out across their vast dominion and saw only compliant vassals and potential offerings, their focus entirely internal. They believed they had mastered the cosmos, balancing the divine ledger with absolute certainty and obsidian blades. They were so focused on the relentless, terrifying task of keeping the sun from falling down that they completely missed the terrifying, pale-skinned storm brewing on the eastern horizon, a catastrophic threat unlike anything their prophecies had ever warned them about. We leave the desperate existential fear of the failing sun and descend now into the physical reality of the beating, monstrous heart of the world, Tenochtitlan itself. This was a city that defied geography, built upon a massive, shallow lake, a floating miracle sustained by a populace numbering perhaps 250,000 souls. A metropolis larger, cleaner, and far more sophisticated than any capital in Europe at that very moment in history. Imagine the traveler approaching. 4 massive stone causeways, like the limbs of some ancient deity, stretched across the vastness of Lake Texcoco, connecting the island to the mainland. These were not mere roads. They were expertly engineered lifelines,
built with strategic gaps and drawbridges to allow the thousands of chalupas, the Aztec canoes, to traverse the watery streets, moving goods, people, and, most critically, the never-ending stream of sacrificial tribute. And the water system. While Paris and London choked on their own filth, relying on contaminated river water, Tenochtitlan drank fresh, crystal-clear spring water delivered by the unparalleled genius of the Chapultepec aqueduct. This massive double-piped system ensured that one pipe could always be cleaned and maintained, while the other delivered life-sustaining water without interruption. They had mastered hydrology, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture with a terrifying efficiency that spoke not of a primitive jungle civilization, but of an empire operating at absolute peak performance, a terrifying machine lubricated by gold, feathers, obsidian, and the steady, rhythmic drumbeat of ritual terror that echoed incessantly from the Great Pyramid. The true measure of their secular, worldly power wasn't just the temples, however, but the colossal market district of Tlatelolco. Every single day, tens of thousands of people gathered in this immense square, the undisputed logistical and economic nexus of the entire Mesoamerican world, a spectacle that overwhelmed even the most seasoned traveler. Picture it, an organized chaos, where everything from simple clay pots and basic foodstuffs to exotic jaguar pelts, precious gold dust mined from the southern mountains, shimmering quetzal feathers, and living slaves traded hands with dizzying speed. The sheer volume of goods, maize, beans, chili, tools, textiles, was staggering, requiring its own dedicated and fiercely enforced judicial system to ensure fair trade, or at least fair subjugation. This market represented the absolute, iron-fisted dominance of the Triple Alliance, sucking the wealth and resources from conquered lands across a region spanning hundreds of miles, a perpetual economic drain, fueled entirely by tribute and the constant, credible threat of lethal reprisal for non-compliance. But never forget the dark price of sustaining this impossible city. Those hundreds of thousands of lives required constant feeding, both physically and, far more importantly, spiritually. The tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan was not just currency, it was the raw fuel for their essential religious obligation, the blood tax owed to the cosmos. Every conquered province knew its quota. So much grain, so many cloaks, so much obsidian, and crucially, so many human captives. The infamous flower wars, those terrifying ritualized conflicts, were not always wars of political conquest in the traditional sense, but truly wars of human harvest, designed specifically to gather the necessary sacrificial vessels. They were fought explicitly to gather enough strong, healthy warriors, the perfect vessels whose beating hearts were deemed the only worthy offering to nourish the thirsty war and sun god, Huitzilopochtli, the one deity who stood between them and the immediate, terrifying plunge into the endless cosmic void. From atop the towering Templo Mayor, The Tlatoani, the ruler, and his high priests, the true architects of this existential horror, watched the bustling, flawless city below. They saw the perfection of the system. The canals ran true, the tribute arrived precisely on time, and the sacrificial queues were always reliably full. They honestly believed they had utterly mastered the cosmos. They felt they held the very stability of reality in their obsidian-bladed hands. Any tiny deviation, any bad omen, the odd flight of a bird, an unexplained ripple on the lake, a minor crack in a temple wall, sent paralyzing shivers through the ruling class, demanding immediate, greater, and faster blood offerings to correct the balance. They were so utterly locked into this internal, terrifying mechanism of self-preservation, the daily, demanding horror of appeasing their volatile gods, that they developed a profound, fatal myopia regarding the world outside their sacred geography. These priests were consummate experts in interpreting cosmic signs, the timing of eclipses, the path of comets, the meaning of droughts. They could read the complex movements of Venus better than any European scholar of the age. But their entire cosmological map was drawn strictly within the sacred, known boundaries of the Mesoamerican world. The idea of a threat emerging from the unthinkable Eastern Sea, carried by beings who appeared like gods, but fought with a ruthless, calculated demonic efficiency, simply could not compute within the sacred, protective geometry of their universe. They were preparing for the world to end via divine hunger, via cosmic collapse. They were not preparing for human invasion. They were looking frantically up at the sky, checking the sun's position, completely missing the cold, hard fact that the real, immediate threat was moving silently and relentlessly across the unforgiving, empty waters, aiming straight for the heart of their floating miracle. The moment of catastrophic contact was imminent, and Tenochtitlan, the greatest, most powerful city the New World had ever known, was catastrophically unprepared for the specific, horrifying brand of apocalypse that was sailing inexorably toward them. The grandeur of Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of the Mexica world, was not just a symbol of power. It was a defiant, screaming challenge hurled into the face of a hostile cosmos that constantly threatened to swallow them whole. They lived on water, a miracle of engineering, a metropolis carved from the heart of Lake Texcoco itself, floating, defiant, and impossibly clean for its time. 4 great causeways, built of stone and earth compacted over centuries, sliced through the shimmering blue expanse, connecting the island capital to the mainland shore, arteries pumping the lifeblood of tribute and thousands of prisoners into the imperial heart. This was not merely a city. It was an entire universe contained within a lacustrine basin, supporting perhaps 200,000 souls, a population rivaling and likely exceeding the grandest centers of Europe, like Paris or Constantinople at the time. Its sheer scale was a testament to the iron will of the Tlatoani
and the terrifying efficacy of their meticulously calculated religion, proving every single day that they were the chosen people keeping the cosmic gears grinding. The surrounding waters were not empty marshes. They were lush, meticulously cultivated floating gardens known as chinampas, these soft mud beds that yielded 4, sometimes 5 harvests a year, ensuring that famine was a ghost rarely seen inside the sacred precinct. But this agricultural perfection required constant vigilance, a terrifying, ceaseless battle against the unpredictable rhythms of the water, controlled by a vast network of dikes and sluice gates. Chief among these was the immense Nezahualcóyotl dike, a 9-mile-long defensive engineering feat that would have made the great Roman builders themselves weep with envy at its audacity and scale.
Every full stomach, every clean street, every drop of potable water delivered via intricate ceramic aqueducts from Chapultepec was proof that the gods were currently satisfied. But that satisfaction was always conditional, always temporary, and always demanded repayment in the most precious currency imaginable. The price for this impossible bounty was never gold or jade. It was the rhythmic, horrifying sacrifice of the human heart, offered wet and smoking, still pulsing, to ensure the sun's daily, desperate journey across the terrifying sky.
At the exact center of this magnificent, manicured island stood the Templo Mayor, the massive twin pyramid structure that was the absolute axis of their world. It was dedicated to the 2 terrifying pillars of Aztec existence: Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the fierce god of war and the sun, who demanded perpetual sustenance to continue his cosmic fight against the utter darkness of the night.
And alongside him stood Tlaloc, the ancient, demanding god of rain and agricultural fertility, whose mood swings could bring either life-giving deluge or devastating flood, and who often preferred the tears and the blood of children to truly appease his ancient mercurial temper. The Templo Mayor was the ultimate stage for the grandest and most appalling performances of the Aztec state, a vertical conduit straight to the heavens, where the great clock of the universe was reset, day after terrifying day, through sheer force of will and rivers of blood.
The empire was not sustained by resources alone. It was fundamentally sustained by fear, not of their enemies, but of the ultimate, final collapse. The world as they knew it had already ended 4 times before, consumed by jaguars, destroyed by hurricane winds, ravaged by fire rain, and drowned by massive, world-ending floods. They lived under the shadow of the 5th sun, the era of Nahui Olin, the sun of movement, which they knew with absolute, terrifying certainty would end in catastrophic earthquakes and consuming famine if the engine of the cosmos was not ceaselessly greased with fresh human essence. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, though the results were horrifying beyond measure.
This was cosmic necessity, a grim, high-stakes theological duty they alone were tasked with performing for the entirety of humanity and the very continuation of the universe.
Every priest, every warrior, every mother in the valley knew that the continued existence of the stars, the ability to see the dawn break the next morning, rested squarely and literally upon the sharp edge of the obsidian sacrificial knife, the Tecpatl. Moctezuma II, the 9th Tlatoani, sat atop this dizzying, blood-drenched structure of power, viewing the world through the lens of absolute divine superiority, his velvet-slippered feet never once touching the profane, vulgar earth.
His court was a spectacle of refined power and chilling efficiency, staffed by thousands of servants, astrologers, and administrators who managed the immense tribute flowing from 48 tributary provinces, a flow that required astronomical logistics, including 38,000 tons of maize, 8,000 tons of beans, and vast quantities of cotton, jewels, and luxury goods annually, just to keep the great capital functioning perfectly.
Such absolute, unquestioned, and theologically justified power breeds a specific kind of paralyzing blindness, a profound conviction that the existing system is flawless, eternal, and capable of solving any problem the cosmos could throw at it, provided the proper rituals were followed. The idea that a threat could arise that did not fit neatly into their existing 4 times destroyed cosmology, a threat that was neither Tlaloc's flood nor Huitzilopochtli's hungry darkness, was simply unthinkable, a catastrophic error in imagination.
The occasional rumble from the east, the unsettling whispers carried by long-distance merchants from the Gulf Coast about strange, large floating mountains and bearded, pale-skinned men were instantly dismissed as inconsequential rumors, or worse, misinterpreted as divine signs meant only to confirm the Tlatoani's unparalleled destined greatness. The existential fear they constantly wrestled with was profoundly internal, theological, and cyclical. They were so obsessively focused on battling the celestial darkness that they catastrophically failed to see the mortal, disease-ridden, steel darkness gathering just beyond the horizon, sailing straight toward their meticulously engineered island paradise, carrying with it a doom far faster and far more decisive than any earthquake or sun failure they had ever known.
The Aztec Empire was a clock ticking toward the midnight of its existence, and the grandest city on earth, the jewel of the lakes, was about to hear a sound The Aztec Empire was a clock ticking toward the midnight of its existence, and the grandest city on earth, the jewel of the lakes, was about to hear a sound it could not possibly categorize, a sound that violated every natural law they understood, the definitive, world-shattering sound of a European cannon.
The sound that ripped across the valley of Mexico was not the roar of a jaguar, nor the wrathful tremor of an earthquake, nor even the expected, dreadful hiss of the sun god Huitzilopochtli demanding his due. It was something mathematically impossible, a violation of the very physics known to the great engineers and astronomers of Tenochtitlan. A single, colossal,
concentrated burst of violence that echoed like a mountain splitting open under divine pressure.
In the heart of the great metropolis, where 50 million stones were perfectly set, and the canals flowed with the ordered precision of a jeweler's mechanism, every human activity stopped. The vendors selling dried fish, the artisans polishing obsidian blades until they shimmered blacker than night, the priests tracing glyphs in the temple compounds, all froze, their blood turning to ice. This was not a natural sound. It was the definitive, synthesized voice of the outside world, a voice they had never prepared for, a voice that spoke in the language of metal and fire, utterly alien to the sacred geometry of their lakes and volcanoes.
Motecuzoma II, the Platoni, the living conduit to the gods, was seated in his chamber, reviewing the complex tributes flowing in from the defeated provinces. When the sound struck, he did not flinch physically, but inside his chest, the meticulous clockwork of his imperial mind finally jammed.
His attendant priests and advisors, masters of interpreting every celestial omen and terrestrial sign, immediately defaulted to the highest tier of dread, the return of Quetzalcoatl. The ancient prophecy, the one that haunted every waking hour of the great emperor, was manifesting not as a feathered serpent in the sky, but as a metallic, invisible thunderclap from the direction of the sea. They desperately scanned the skies, searched the lake surface for impossible waves, seeking a mythological creature to explain the horror. They were looking for a sign from the heavens. They were not looking for a simple, technological innovation held by 40 desperate, bearded men. This fundamental misclassification was the first fatal error in the Aztec defense strategy. The scouts sent out were already riding back, their reports frantic, confusing, and contradictory. They had seen ships, not canoes, not rafts, but colossal floating structures that moved against the current and wind, propelled by huge sheets of white cloth, carrying men encased in shining, unbreakable skins. These men, the messengers stammered, were pale, their features sharp and strange, and they possessed terrifying beasts that were taller than a man, moved with unnatural speed, and whose hooves struck the earth like hammers. The horses, unknown to Mesoamerica, were instantly integrated into the nightmare pantheon of the arriving gods. The sheer terror of the initial reports was amplified by the inability of the Aztecs to categorize what they were seeing using their established worldview. The invaders did not behave like enemies. They did not use traditional weapons, darts, atlatls, obsidian blades, and they definitely did not follow the established rules of ritual combat. Their purpose, the scouts reported with horrified bewilderment, was not to capture or subdue for sacrifice. Their purpose seemed to be simple, absolute annihilation. They killed wantonly, indiscriminately, violating the sacred honor of war which demanded a captive for the appeasement of the sun. Moctezuma, trapped by his own theological brilliance, interpreted this violence and alien appearance not as brute military superiority, but as the overwhelming, uncompromising power of deities who could afford to ignore human rules. The only sensible path was submission and appeasement, amplified by the highest level of magnificence. He made the decision that would seal the fate of his empire and provide the Spanish with the fuel for their madness. He would drown these terrifying envoys in gold. He ordered his treasuries opened. The sun disk, a masterpiece of hammered gold the size of a shield, and the moon disk, crafted from pure silver, were prepared. Cloaks woven from the impossibly iridescent plumage of the quetzal and the hummingbird, thousands of pounds of jade, emeralds, and turquoise, all were assembled. The intent was to show the terrifying visitors the immense power and wealth of Tenochtitlan, hoping to satisfy them, perhaps even to bribe them into sailing away. But to the Spanish, starving, weary, and haunted by the knowledge of how few they were, this deluge of unbelievable wealth was not a sign of diplomatic respect. It was the definitive confirmation of every greedy legend they had ever heard. It was proof that the Aztec ruler was weak, fearful, and had untold oceans of gold waiting to be plundered. Cortés, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unforgiving as the steel of his sword, immediately understood the fatal psychological trap the Aztecs had fallen into. They were fighting gods they could not touch, rather than men who bled and could be killed. He received the gifts not with awe, but with cold, calculating avarice, demanding to know where the gold was mined, how it was forged. Every question was a probe, every answer confirming the immense, untapped reservoir of wealth that lay just beyond the causeways. The column of invaders, now bolstered by thousands of vengeful, fiercely dedicated Tlaxcalan and Sempoalan warriors who hated the Aztec yoke more than they feared the pale strangers, began its slow, inexorable march inland. They were moving towards the colossal heart of the empire, a glittering prize floating in a massive, shimmering lake. The great city, Tenochtitlan, the serpent city of the lakes, continued its cycle of meticulous sacrifices and profound cosmic anxiety, blind to the true, immediate nature of the doom that was approaching. They feared the sun failing. They failed to see the shadow that metal and gunpowder had already cast over their world. The great city of Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the lake, was a humming, terrifying engine of human civilization, yet even its relentless pulse could not drown out the growing sound of dread echoing from the far-off eastern coasts. The priests had finished their grim calculus. The blood flowed, but the sky remained an angry, unforgiving canvas, and the omens, oh, the omens, multiplied like locusts. Moctezuma the Younger,
the most powerful man on the face of the earth, stood paralyzed in his golden chamber, besieged not by armies, but by the relentless, crushing weight of prophecy. He was a man consumed by the ancient texts, a prisoner of the very gods he sought to appease, and the latest whispers carried a chilling impossibility. They spoke of mountains sailing upon the water, their massive white wings tearing the horizon open. These were not the feathered serpents of legend, but constructions of staggering, impossible scale, spitting wood and swallowing wind, creatures of pure nightmare born from the salt spray. The first messengers arrived, their eyes wide and strained, their feet bleeding from the frantic trek across the Sierra Madre Oriental. They did not speak of warriors or invaders. They spoke of spirits, of beings whose skin was pale as polished bone, covered in shining scales that defied the thrust of any obsidian blade. They carried thunder in their hands, the messengers recounted, a sound that split the jungle and dissolved the earth, followed by the acrid, terrifying scent of sulphurous death. The sheer alienness of these reports short-circuited the sophisticated ritualistic minds of the Aztec leadership. This was not a border skirmish with the Tlaxcalans. This was an event outside the known universe, a rupture in the very fabric of their reality. They had categorized every threat, every deity, every possible cosmic shift. But these creatures, these tales, were unclassifiable. Moctezuma, desperate for context, turned immediately to the ancient prophecies of Seacalt, the date when Quetzalcoatl, the exiled god, was foretold to return from the Eastern Sea. It was a perfect, deadly coincidence, a historical accident that sealed the fate of millions, transforming an avaricious band of desperate Spanish adventurers into terrifying, divine heralds. The emperor's greatest strength, his deep, devout adherence to the sacred calendar and divine law, was now his greatest weakness. To fight these beings meant challenging the divine decree itself. To welcome them meant courting unimaginable risk. The priesthood, the powerful Tlacatecutli, split into panicked factions, unable to reconcile the terror before them with the established cosmology. The descriptions intensified. Giant, terrifying deer without horns, creatures that moved with unnatural speed and power, carrying the pale riders high above the common earth. The sight of a Spaniard mounted on a horse, a sight never before witnessed in the Americas, was the final, devastating flourish of the omen. They saw a centaur, a composite monstrosity, a terrifying fusion of man and beast, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a battle axe slicing through air. Panic, once a distant tremor, began to ripple beneath the polished obsidian floors of the great temples, threatening to shatter the ritualized order of the capital. Moctezuma dispatched emissaries, not soldiers. This act, born of deep religious terror and crippling indecision, was the first official invitation to disaster. The gifts he sent were intended as appeasement for a god.
massive gold discs carved with the sun and moon, turquoise necklaces, featherwork so exquisite it was meant only for the divine gaze.
These gifts, however, acted merely as fuel for the Spanish fire, transforming the vague promise of wealth into a searing, irresistible reality. Cortés, the ruthless captain waiting on the humid coast, did not see religious tribute. He saw the confirmation of his wildest, most desperate dreams of staggering, untold riches. He saw the staggering, terrifying vulnerability of this immense, unbelievably wealthy empire. He learned through interpreters, broken, terrified Totonac informants, that the Aztec world was not a monolithic block of power, but a fragile pyramid built upon generations of ruthless subjugation and simmering resentment. The Tlaxcalans, the perennial, bitter enemies of the Mexica, were waiting, burning with the desire for vengeance, desperate to see the downfall of the Triple Alliance. The tributaries, forced to pay the terrible tax of required labor and sacrificial victims, were restless, their loyalty thin as papyrus. The empire, strong as it appeared, was a ticking clock of internal rebellion, needing only the catalyst of an external, unbelievable force to detonate. And Cortés, the opportunistic, cold-eyed devil, was precisely that force. While Tenochtitlan bustled, its massive Tlatelolco market selling everything from jade to human flesh, its immense aqueducts delivering clean mountain water, its armies drilling in flawless formation, the fatal error had already been made in the emperor's chamber. The decision to greet the invaders with ritual awe instead of immediate military might was a catastrophic misjudgment, a historical pause that allowed the metallic shadow to lengthen and solidify. They were waiting for the sun to fail, completely blind to the fact that the sun was about to be eclipsed by the smoke of gunpowder, not the absence of Huitzilopochtli's favor. The great wheels of gold were carried out of the city, a procession of tragedy heading east, signaling to the waiting pale demons that the riches were real, the power was immense, and the rulers were terrified and confused. The Aztec world, perfected over centuries of blood sacrifice and architectural genius, was preparing to offer its neck to the razor, mistaking the gleam of European steel for the benevolent light of a returning god. The whispers grew louder, traveling faster than the fastest runner. The gods have returned, and they are hungry for more than blood. They are hungry for gold. The stage was set for the collision of two worlds, one built on ritual, prophecy, and the existential fear of cosmic instability, the other built on steel, ambition, and the ravenous, unforgiving thirst for absolute conquest. The dawn was not breaking, the world was ending. The year was one reed, a year of profound, terrifying significance, but Tenochtitlan ignored the tremors beneath its foundations. They were too busy admiring the reflection of their own unparalleled greatness
in the clear, filtered waters of Lake Texcoco. This was not merely a city. It was a hydraulic miracle, a floating fortress built on the backs of millions and powered by the frantic rhythm of the sacrificial drum.
The massive stone jaws of the Coetpantli, the serpent wall, encircled the sacred precinct, a chilling promise of the violence that sustained the cosmos. Inside, the twin peaks of the Templo Mayor pierced the humid sky, dedicated simultaneously to the water god Tlaloc and the bloodthirsty sun god Huitzilopochtli, signifying the Aztec obsession with creation and necessary destruction. The colossal heart of the empire beat with a dual rhythm, the steady, life-giving flow of water and the volatile, demanding torrent of blood. And this duality was their strength, their fatal flaw, and the very structure of their world, perfectly balanced on the sharp edge of a sacrificial knife. The city's survival was dependent entirely on the ingenious chinampas, the so-called floating gardens, vast rectangular plots anchored meticulously in the swampy lakebed, endlessly fertile, generating an almost unbelievable surplus of maize, beans, squash, and chili, necessary to feed a metropolis of 200,000 souls. These were the true green lungs of the empire, breathing life into a population that dwarfed every major European capital combined, a feat of agricultural engineering that mocked the muddy fields of Castile. Every single morning, long before the sun's first rays struck the gold ornamentation of Moctezuma's palace, thousands of canoes, laden with every commodity imaginable, flowed into the city center along the 4 great causeways, navigating a complex network of canals wider and cleaner than anything Rome had ever envisioned. The great market of Tlatelolco, a separate, equally colossal entity attached to the capital, pulsed with a commercial energy so intense it could only be described as overwhelming, driven by an economic engine that spanned half a continent.
Imagine the deafening roar. 60,000 people trading obsidian blades sharp enough to shave a hair, brilliant featherwork capes woven from the iridescent plumage of the quetzal bird, shimmering bolts of dyed cotton, massive cakes of white salt harvested meticulously from the lake's diminishing edges, and slabs of precious jade. This was the absolute pinnacle of Mesoamerican engineering and commerce, a sophisticated system humming with lethal, organized efficiency, the very definition of supreme authority. Yet this immense wealth and astonishing order were held rigidly in place by absolute, terrifying compliance, and a social structure built to channel every resource, human and material, directly to the central, sacred cause. Every citizen belonged to a kalpuli, a neighborhood clan unit, rigorously structured for both intensive labor and immediate military service. There was no escape from the collective duty. The individual existed solely to serve the state, and most crucially, to appease the demanding, volatile gods who held the lever of time.
The priests and the high-ranking nobility, the pipiltin, moved through the packed streets with an almost inhuman air of entitlement and power, their polished jade and hammered gold jewelry flashing dangerously in the sunlight, their authority absolute and entirely unquestioned, because they were the designated intermediaries of the divine. They alone were capable of reading the shifting, terrifying calendar cycles that governed existence, translating the will of the cosmos into mandatory action for the common people, the Masehualtin. Their unparalleled power was not derived from mere accumulated wealth, but from the chilling ability to interpret the celestial warnings that constantly whispered of impending drought, devastating famine, and the ultimate, horrific possibility that the fifth sun, their current era, would suffer cosmic exhaustion and simply stop moving in the sky, plunging the world into a final, irreversible darkness. The priests truly believed, with every fiber of their being, that every successful harvest, every decisive victory in the endless flower wars, Xochiayoyotl, every single sunrise itself, was not a given, but a direct, temporary loan granted begrudgingly by the sun god Huitzilopochtli, repayable only in the crimson, steaming currency of human hearts. It wasn't malice that fueled the sacrifices. It was pure, terrifying cosmic maintenance, a religious duty that surpassed all morality and reason. To them, the massive, deeply stained stone block of the Tecatl upon the summit of the Templo Mayor, where the sacrifices were performed with cold precision, was not an altar of death, but the sacred, pounding engine of universal life, the essential piston pumping necessary blood into the dying heart of the universe, ensuring the continuity of light. The scale of this operation was utterly staggering, meticulously managed by the Calmecac temple schools, where young priests were trained from childhood in the intricate, chilling rituals of extraction and presentation. Thousands upon thousands of captives, taken systematically from regions like the ever-defiant Tlaxcala or other perpetually hostile territories, were brought in precise numerical order to the capital, their ultimate fate sealed and recorded long before their arduous arrival. The sheer logistics of managing this vast human flow, ensuring the supply chain of fresh victims never faltered, speaks volumes to the horrifying organizational genius and absolute confidence of the Aztec Empire. Imagine the ever-present sound of the conch shell trumpet, a mournful, piercing blast that cut through the morning mist, signaling the start of the ritual day, echoing across the massive lake. Imagine the relentless, hypnotic beat of the great drum, Huehuetl, reverberating across the massive sacred square, a sound that penetrated every single home, a constant, visceral reminder of the immense, non-negotiable debt owed to the sky and the sun. This deafening symphony of absolute faith and pervasive terror was the background noise of Tenochtitlan's glory years. They were so utterly consumed by the internal pressure, the necessary pressure to feed the gods, to keep the sun alive, to manage their own terrifyingly complex, bloody system of existence, that they lacked the mental bandwidth to even process the faintest rumor of an external threat that did not fit their established mythological schema. The confusing prophecies concerning Quetzalcoatl's potential return were just one small, confusing piece of the astronomical puzzle that required interpretation. Their primary, paralyzing focus remained fixed entirely on the precarious stability of the sun above the pyramid, not on the churning, salt-laced horizon where the new metal gods were silently, inexorably approaching, driven by an alien hunger for gold and souls. They had built the greatest, most powerful city the world had ever seen, a jewel of breathtaking architecture and meticulously organized violence, a place where gold was commonplace and human life was the most precious, perishable commodity. They had mastered the lake, mastered the land, and tragically believed, in their terrifying certainty, that they had mastered the very cosmos itself. This belief, this beautiful, terrible arrogance, was the final, strongest psychological wall separating them from the ugly, unavoidable reality. And now, the steel tide, carried by wooden boats and driven by a ravenous, alien fury, was preparing to smash against that cultural wall, utterly unconcerned with the debt Moctezuma owed to Huitzilopochtli, or the precise calendar count of the fifth sun. The engine of Tenochtitlan was running perfectly, fueled by blood and confidence. But outside the serpent wall, an unseen, brutal hand was reaching for the kill switch. The world was ending, and the greatest empire in the Americas was too busy sacrificing to even notice the ominous shadows lengthening rapidly behind them. They believed their rituals secured the cosmos. They believed the obsidian blade, slick with the lifeblood of thousands, was the only thing standing between humanity and the howling darkness of the fifth sun's demise. But the darkness was not coming from the heavens. It was gathering on the periphery, masked by the very arrogance that defined their golden age. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the world, was a gilded cage of self-deception, utterly convinced of its own invincibility, yet internally hollowed out by fear and hatred. The brutal truth of the Aztec Empire was that it was not an empire of unified subjects, but a fragile hegemony built on the backs of terrified, exploited tributaries who yearned for the day the terrible hand of the Triple Alliance would be broken. Moctezuma II, the great speaker, the Tlatoani whose word commanded the sacrifice of nations, presided over a dominion already rotten at the core, suffering from a crippling, self-inflicted political isolation. For decades, the Aztec Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, had played a dangerous, bloody game with the mountainous kingdom of Tlaxcala, a fierce, independent state nestled just 80 miles to the east. The Tlaxcalans were the perpetual thorn, the one nation they could not, or perhaps would not, fully extinguish, trapping them in a constant state of agonizing siege. The official reason, whispered in the Grand Calpulli schools, was the Flowery War, the Xochitl, a beautiful, deadly euphemism for mandated carnage. The true purpose was chillingly pragmatic. maintain a constant, steady supply of elite warrior captives for the ravenous appetite of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south. These were not wars of conquest, but wars of harvest. The two sides would agree on a date, a time, and a place to meet, not to annihilate the other, but specifically to capture the strongest, most noble warriors, whose hearts would be deemed worthy enough to feed the starving sun god. This constant, ritualized bloodshed bred a hatred in the Tlaxcalans so profound, so absolute, that it transcended generations. Every captured Tlaxcalan warrior dragged back across the causeways to face the high priests on the Templo Mayor meant another family in the eastern mountains, swearing a blood oath against the tyrants of the lake. Moctezuma, intoxicated by the sheer scale of his power and the divine mandate of sacrifice, failed to see the danger. He saw only a reliable captive farm, ensuring his theological supply chain remained unbroken. But deep within the palace walls, far removed from the public spectacle of blood and glory, a different kind of tension simmered. Cuitlawak, Moctezuma's own brother, and the respected Tlatoani of Iztapalapa, watched the obsession with Tlaxcala and the endless cycle of sacrifice with growing dread. Cuitlawak was the pragmatist, the true warrior who still adhered to the ruthless logic of conquest, not ritual. He saw the Tlaxcalans not as perpetual prey, but as a coiled viper, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. He argued fiercely, behind closed doors, shielded by heavy feathered screens, that the siege must end, that Tlaxcala must be either crushed entirely or, terrifyingly, brought into the fold as a true ally before an even greater enemy arrived. Cuitlawak understood the simple arithmetic of survival, unified power or utter obliteration. But Moctezuma was paralyzed not by military fear, but by theological terror. He had become less a ruler and more a head priest, his every decision filtered through the desperate need to appease the deities, demanding ever more blood in the face of increasingly dire omens. The year was one reed, 1519 in the foreign calendar, and the omens had ceased being subtle warnings. They were now outright screams echoing through the valley of Mexico. 8 terrifying signs ripped through the fabric of reality, each one more horrifying than the last, confirming the priest's darkest fears, that the 5th sun truly was ready to be snuffed out. The first, a column of fire, wider than a man and brighter than the morning star, burned for an entire year in the eastern sky, visible even at midday. The second, the temple of Huitzilopochtli, suddenly burst into flames, self-ignited by some unseen, furious hand, even as priests desperately poured water onto the blaze, the water turning instantly to steam and smoke. The third, a bolt of lightning, weak and powerless against stone normally, struck the straw-thatched temple of Xiuhtecuhtli, the god of fire, instantly reducing the sanctuary to ash and smoking ruin. Then came the 4th sign, a sudden, blinding shower of fire, meteors crashing across the night sky, their tails spitting malevolent sparks of doom. The waters of the immense Lake Texcoco, usually calm and predictable, began to boil without cause. They surged violently, flooding the city and smashing houses against the causeways, an impossible, spontaneous cataclysm of water and steam that terrified the thousands of residents living in the floating districts. The sixth omen was the sound of weeping, a woman's terrible wail, heard every night across the lake, crying out, my children, we are lost. Where shall I take you to save you from this doom?" It was the dreadful, prophetic voice of Cihuacoatl, the serpent woman, weeping for the downfall of her entire civilization. The seventh sign was the capture of an impossible creature, a rare water bird caught by fishermen, sporting a circular mirror on the crown of its head. Brought before Moctezuma, the Tlatoani looked into the polished surface and saw not his reflection, but a vision of a strange, pale army riding deer-like beasts into battle.
And the final sign, the most ghastly, were the monsters found in the streets. Two-headed men, creatures with 4 eyes, deformities that were instantly captured and brought before the great ruler, only to vanish into thin air the moment Moctezuma finished looking upon them.
All of these portents, these terrifying, unearthly signals, focused the entirety of Aztec leadership on the cosmos. They were looking up, convinced the danger was celestial, failing entirely to look eastward, across the mountains, where the hatred of Tlaxcala was a festering wound, and the brutal hand of true destiny was reaching for the kill switch. The world was ending, and the greatest empire in the Americas was too busy sacrificing to even notice the ominous shadows lengthening rapidly behind them. Shadows that were not cast by the sun, but by the relentless march of human greed and steel.